I am the anomaly. You know, as a scientist, I'm so used to just going to science meetings. But it is such a unique situation here, especially with the other speakers, where I have such admiration for the clinicians and the coaches, because that is something I'm not well suited for. That's not my personality, to be able to sit one-to-one with someone and walk them through the implementation of these ideas. My strength is giving the idea. So thank you for letting me just be a teacher or a professor. It's a better use of my skills. I hope you will be the judge of that ultimately. But I want to make sure we spend some time together discussing the relevance of fat cells when it comes to insulin resistance. Now, just to put things in perspective, these are some of the most common problems on the planet. Being overweight affects roughly half of all adults worldwide, and having insulin resistance affects more than half of all adults. The statistics on this are very difficult because most studies haven't measured it. I actually state quite confidently, based on a paper published a few years ago, that up to 88% of adults in the US have insulin resistance. That was based on a survey that was done out of UNC, Chapel Hill, where they found that 88% of all adults have at least one metric or one aspect of the metabolic syndrome. And remember, the metabolic syndrome was once called, and more accurately should still be called, the insulin resistance syndrome. That was the original term for that cluster of complications. Now, why would a scientist devote his career to studying insulin resistance? It's because the problems that come from it are so myriad. Virtually every chronic disease, or what I call the plagues of prosperity, despite their differences, they all have one thing in common, which is insulin resistance. And thus, so much of my time is spent bringing people's attention to it, because I believe it makes the most sense to focus on one variable that can influence all of these diseases, rather than trying to focus on all of the distinct, separate, individual stimuli. All right, now, these are related. The fact that half the adult population globally is overweight, more than half are insulin resistant, that is not coincident. We are in fact now touching on causality. What is it then about the fat cell that increases insulin resistance? Well, by way of a brief background, people can gain fat through two different mechanisms. Now, this is such an important idea because it suggests that fat mass doesn't matter as much as we think it does. It's the size of the fat cell that matters. That's what I hope to impress upon you. So how can we gain fat? We humans get fat through two different mechanisms. We either get fat through the size of each individual fat cell expanding. That's a process called hypertrophy. In that scenario, the fat cell number itself doesn't change, so the fat cell number stays the same, but the size of each fat cell is growing. As opposed to hyperplasia, which is when the size of the fat cell is relatively static. The fat cells are staying quite small, but they are multiplying. So the number of fat cells is expanding. And each of these is causing fat gain in people to varying degrees. Now, unfortunately, most people, this is about 80% of all people who get to the realm of overweight and obese, so the vast majority of us, get fat through the process of hypertrophy. That is a problem for two reasons that we'll review right now. First, and quite simply, the fat cell starts to run out of room. As the fat cell begins to expand, it starts to reach a literal point of maximum dimension. And I'm going to show you some evidence later on that will help impress upon you just the degree of that expansion. But there is no cell in the body that is capable of expanding to the same degree that the fat cell is capable of. There's nothing comparable to it. Now, when the fat cell begins to reach a point of maximum dimension, it's like a water balloon that's getting overfilled. And the water balloon that's about to get overfilled, it's going to pop. And the fat cell, sensing that it is reaching the limit of what its membrane can hold, will start to become resistant to the insulin signal. It basically starts to tell insulin, you are attempting to continue to force me to get fatter and fatter. And we're going to touch on that in great detail soon enough. And in order for me to not blow up, I'm going to stop listening to you. I'm going to become deaf to the growth signal you're giving me. So the fat cell begins to basically tell insulin, there's no vacancy here, I can't listen anymore, and thus becomes insulin resistant to stop growing to ensure its own survival. I hope that makes sense. Now, at the same time this is happening, we have an entirely separate pathology or problem developing. And that's a result of blood flow. The fat cell begins to suffocate. All cells need to be within just a few micrometers of a blood vessel, a capillary. The capillary is the part of the blood vessel system where you're actually exchanging stuff. It gets the oxygen to the cell. It takes the CO2 from the cell. The cell can get nutrients. It can give off its waste metabolites. That all happens at a capillary. And so the cell must be very, very close to a capillary. Well, that's fine when the fat cells are quite small, like you see here. It is less fine when the fat cell has undergone hypertrophy, because now the fat cell can get up to a diameter of 300 micrometers. That is several times the distance that a cell is supposed to be next to a capillary. And this becomes problematic as the fat cells are essentially, as they're growing, pushing each other further and further away from the life-giving blood. So as the cells are expanding, they're forcing their neighbors to start suffocating. They are literally lacking oxygen. They become what is called, at the level of the cell, hypoxic. That's a cell term. We don't use that term to describe the body. We would just say the body is suffocating. But if we describe that same phenomenon at the level of the cell, we would say it's hypoxic, low oxygen. In order to try to correct this, the fat cell begins calling out for help. It begins sending out signals through this fluid outside the blood vessels in order to try to recruit the blood vessels to start growing over to where they are. It's essentially a little trail of breadcrumbs. And this trail of breadcrumbs is happening through a process called inflammation by releasing cytokines. So this is causing inflammation, but it's also having the effect with some of these cytokines, which are basically just pro-inflammatory hormones, to induce the growth of new capillaries. So once again, the fat cell, in order to ensure its own survival, is becoming pro-inflammatory. So it's having disastrous effects throughout the rest of the body, but the fat cell's just trying to survive. It's hard for us to blame the fat cell for wanting to survive. But these two problems end up occurring together. The fat cell becomes insulin resistant to stop its growth, and it becomes pro-inflammatory to try to correct its hypoxia or its suffocation. This idea is what's invoked, whether it is known or not, when we talk about the personal fat threshold, or what I call the fat cell threshold. Have you heard of that term before, the personal fat threshold? Yeah. So I do think it's more accurate to refer to it as a fat cell threshold. This is the idea that a person has a genetic ability to store fat in one of two ways, through hypertrophy or through hyperplasia. Once those fat cells, and so that would be the limit, and I'm just arbitrarily setting on this human being right here that you see, we've said this is their threshold. Now that's not to say that they have something magic about storing fat below their clavicle. That's just meant to sort of be a teaching mechanism here. So a person's going to have an optimal amount of fat, or a limit to the amount of fat they can store. And again, that's going to be based entirely on the size of their fat cells. Now, if a person has a given amount of fat stored in their fat cells and they are below their threshold, then they're going to be insulin sensitive. No matter how much fat that is. Remember, mass of fat doesn't matter. It's the size of the fat cell that matters most. And so if the amount of fat they have is below that threshold, in other words, the fat cells still have room to grow, then they're going to be insulin sensitive. If, however, they are pushing up past that threshold, the fat cells were saying, I only wanted to get this big, any further growth is now pushing me beyond what I'm comfortable with. Now we've gone into the realm of being insulin resistant. Now, just as an interesting aside, if we took this exact scenario where the person has gotten fat to the point that they've passed their fat cell threshold, and if we gave them a drug that enabled their fat cells to start multiplying, what would happen to their insulin sensitivity if we basically told the fat cells, hey, we're going to allow you to make more of you, recreate more fat cells, you're going to get fatter, but what would happen at the same time? They would become more insulin sensitive. There is in fact an entire class of drugs, the thiazolidinediones, that act primarily through that mechanism. You can take an overweight or obese type 2 diabetic who's profoundly insulin resistant and do nothing more than increase their fat ability to reproduce and become hyperplastic or hyperplasia, and they will paradoxically both get fatter than they were before and more insulin sensitive. That's why I state so definitively that the mass of fat matters less than the size of the fat cells. Interestingly, Wegovy and Ozempic may have similar effects at multiplying fat cells. We can address that in the Q&A. I don't have time, so don't distract me with that. Okay, now, just to really put a fine point on this idea, we know one of the reasons why I did my postdoctoral work in Singapore, of all places, and why Duke University even opened a med school there. I'm a BYU guy all the way through and through, but I'm also now I'm a Duke guy too because of my postdoc time there. I loved my experience there. One of our daughters was born while we were living in Singapore, but the reason Singapore was so interested in studying metabolic disorders and diabetes was to try to understand some of the ethnic differences. Why is it that, for example, you could take a Caucasian man who had the exact same level of fatness as a South Asian or an Indian man, and one is profoundly metabolically sick and the other is perfectly healthy? It's because of the size of the fat cells. This is a literal adipose biopsy or a belly fat biopsy comparing the size of the fat cells from a Caucasian or Northern European man versus a South Asian or Indian man. They were the same fatness. And look at the difference in size of the fat cell. Volumetrically, all we can see in this two-dimensional image is diameter, but volumetrically, diameter cubed, it ends up being fat cells that are about 20 times larger in the South Asian man than the Caucasian man. But again, they're the same fatness. So who has a higher threshold? The Caucasian, of course, because he has so many more fat cells to carry the metabolic burden. And so the threshold will be much, much higher on him. That means if you take these two exact same fatness men, they have the same percent body fat, and now you say, okay, who's going to be insulin sensitive and who's insulin resistant? Well, it all is a matter of who has reached their threshold or not. No surprise, of course, that at the same level of fatness on average, the South Asian man will be very insulin resistant, whereas the Caucasian, Northern European man will be perfectly fine. He just doesn't look as good in his Speedo anymore as he did before. Now, as just a final point on this, another little tangent within a tangent perhaps, who is going to have the higher insulin levels? Remember, or if you've never heard me talk about it, high insulin is a critical feature. It is both cause and consequence of insulin resistance. There is no such thing as insulin resistance without hyperinsulinemia or elevated insulin. Anyone, for example, another tangent within the tangent within the tangent, where this is relevant is if you've ever heard someone talk about physiological insulin resistance in the context of a low-carb or ketogenic diet, don't believe anything else they're saying, because it is such malarkey. It is such nonsense. I'm happy to address that later as time allows. It is completely ridiculous. So, in the Caucasian population, fasting insulin about 9 microunits per mil, which is higher than I like, but much lower than what you see in the South Asian population, where the fasting average insulin is up into the high teens. Okay, now you know that large fat cells are problematic and they contribute to insulin resistance. But what has made them get big in the first place? Now I'm touching on a much deeper conversation. Yes, I'm kind of getting into why we get fat. What is it that makes people gain fat? And then we're going to flip the whole thing around and talk about what is it that allows the fat cells to shrink. Before we do that, let's look at it from this perspective. There are 2 variables that must be met, and you're going to be patient enough to allow me to describe them. Elevated insulin is critical. Insulin must be elevated for fat cells to grow. It is absolutely completely impossible for a fat cell to grow in the absence of elevated insulin. We're going to explore that in more detail. But at the same time, you must have sufficient energy. To state it, I hope, quite clearly, elevated insulin is essential to tell the fat cell to grow, but the calories are needed to fuel the growth. You cannot have one without the other, and we're going to pull these apart in a little more detail. Let's look firstly at the energy side of the equation, because that's the one that the conventional thinking obsesses over. Remember though, we're just looking at this at the level of the fat cell. So with abundant energy, we would have abundant glucose. Glucose can fuel fat cell growth quite readily, and so too are triglycerides. Triglycerides, of course, triglycerides don't just circulate on their own. Whenever you're getting your triglyceride levels measured, you're actually measuring a fraction of a triglyceride-rich lipoprotein. In other words, you're measuring the portion of a lipoprotein that has triglycerides in it, which is going to be like VLDL or LDL. Triglycerides do not circulate on their own. It's always a part of a lipoprotein. So glucose and triglycerides, the fats from the triglycerides, are capable of fueling growth. Now, however, the fat cell has a way of getting rid of that energy, which is by breaking down the triglycerides through lipolysis and increasing the free fatty acids. Anytime you see free fatty acids in the blood, it is by necessity a fat that is coming from a fat cell. So triglycerides are a fat that's on its way to be stored or burned. Free fatty acids are the breakdown product from the fat cell. This, in its simplest, is the caloric theory. That it is simply a matter of more energy going in than out at the fat cell level. That is the caloric theory in its simplest form with regards to explaining obesity. Now, however, how is it regulated? How does the fat cell know when it should be taking in energy and storing it rather than breaking it down? Cells do not have their own intelligence. They don't have the ability to understand what's happening within the entire body. They don't have a fine sense of the metabolic milieu, if you will. They must be told what to do. For example, if someone is exercising, when we exercise, we have an abundance of energy in the blood. Free fatty acids are going up, glucose levels are going up. Why doesn't the fat cell, how does the fat cell know that it shouldn't be pulling in energy, that it should in fact be releasing it? How did it get that signal? It's not literally connected to the muscle that's making us run the track or do pull-ups or push-ups. The fat cell isn't doing that work. How does the fat cell know that the rest of the body is doing something else, exercising in particular? Of course, it's hormones. Hormones are the way various tissues will signal or communicate with other tissues, or cells will send a signal to another cell. And this brings us, of course, to insulin, which is the mother of all metabolic hormones. Nothing has the control over metabolic function that insulin has. It takes a small army of hormones to just try to undo or to balance out what insulin alone is capable of doing. It is so strong. It is so strong of an effect. Now, what is insulin doing? There are two features I'd want you to appreciate. One, insulin increases energy uptake into cells, most especially in this context, fat cells. And second, insulin reduces overall energy output. It doesn't want the body to be burning energy. It wants the body to store energy. That is insulin's thematic or overall effect. Okay, for the first one, it increases the uptake into cells. Very much so, it does this by increasing glucose uptake. So insulin will stimulate glucose uptake into the fat cell, then the fat cell will turn that glucose into fat and does so very, very well. It will also increase the pulling off of fats from triglycerides to pull in. It doesn't directly increase the fatty acid uptake, but it increases the production or the pulling off of the fatty acids, and then the fat cell can just passively pull them in. Now, what about reducing energy output? At the level of the fat cell alone, insulin's most powerful effect is to inhibit lipolysis. It will result in a reduction in the free fatty acids. This is, in its simplest form, the endocrine theory of why fat cells get big. In other words, it's all hormones. Just to really put a fine point on it, I want to share with you what I do in my lab, some of what I do in my lab at BYU. Right now, I have students in my lab that are growing fat cells in little petri dishes. These fat cells are swimming in a soupy little broth of calories. They have tons of glucose and tons of lipids available to them to grow with. They have everything they need, and yet the fat cells stay small and skinny, if you will. They're not growing. My students are worried. They worry that they've killed the culture of cells. They're coming, Dr. Bikman, the fat cells are not getting fat. You know, one of the great ironies of lab work is that it's difficult to grow fat cells. Muscle cells can grow like weeds. You spit on them and they're growing. Isn't that ironic? We wish it were that way in our own bodies. It's not. They think, the students worry that the fat cells are broken. Why aren't they growing? They have all these calories because they need to be told what to do. And within hours of us spiking some insulin into that culture, immediately they're bigger. Check them 24 hours later, they're bigger again. Check them 24 hours later, and they're bigger again. They must be told what to do, and insulin is that signal. Just to make sure it is exceptionally clear, because I know we get this idea is challenged. Fat cells absolutely cannot grow unless insulin is elevated. It is completely impossible. Now, let's create some interesting scenarios as we transition the conversation into, rather than exploring the growth of the fat cell, now turning it backwards and looking at what are the variables that need to occur for the fat cells to shrink. Because remember, by shrinking the fat cells, we improve, that is the first step of improving insulin sensitivity. Chronic, prolonged insulin resistance. Once you start shrinking the fat cells, you alleviate that metabolic burden, and the insulin resistance begins to improve. Now, what happens if energy stays high, but insulin itself is low? This, in fact, could be reflected in a ketogenic diet. If Dr. Tro is eating 8 steaks, that's a lot of calories. But it's not going to be spiking insulin. And we'll look at how macros affect insulin in a moment. So if energy is still high, but insulin is low, how on earth can fat cells shrink if it's completely a matter of calories? Well, there are 2 things, at least, among perhaps many, that are relevant here. When insulin is low, first of all, the body will have an increased energy expenditure. Metabolic rate will climb. And on the other hand, or the next part of this, is that as you begin making ketones, and you are breathing or urinating out the ketones, you are wasting energy. We normally, these people, these knuckleheads who want to invoke the laws of thermodynamics, as if and I got a PhD in bioenergetics. I'm among, if I may be so bold, the most qualified people on the planet to talk about energy in living organisms. I have a unique appreciation for calories, albeit as a somewhat weird way of measuring energy, but I nevertheless appreciate those carbons and how they need to be burned or stored. So I'm not trying to reject the laws of thermodynamics. I simply believe, well, I know there's no belief here. We don't look at them correctly in most instances. But there is this phenomenon of wasting energy. Every ketone has a caloric value roughly similar to glucose. Did you know that? Ketones have a caloric value. And when you're in ketosis, you're breathing out energy. Every bit of ketone you're blowing and measuring on a meter is energy. It's literal calories coming out. Or you're urinating them out when you're peeing on a little keto stick. That's energy coming out of your body that didn't need to be burned through exercise, and it didn't get stored. You just wasted it. And you can't stop wasting energy when insulin is low, because if insulin is low, you literally can't keep it. Insulin is going to activate these wasteful processes, increasing metabolic rate, which is biochemically a little wasteful, excreting ketones, which biochemically is wasteful. This is just some of the ways insulin resolves thermodynamics. Now, what's remarkable about insulin is that we have a perfect human model. So often we basic scientists will use cells and we use rodents, and there's always this lingering worry, well, does it actually still apply in humans? We need not even worry about it. We have a perfect, what's called an insulin knockout model. That's a term we use in genetics to refer to mice that have had a gene knocked out of them. We have humans that can't make insulin. And thus, we have a perfect example. I have to just mention these legends. I first stumbled on this work about 10 years ago or so. This was work by literally legends in their fields, which is to say no one knows who they are. Elliot P. Joslin is the godfather of modern endocrinology. One of the most famous endocrine clinics on the planet is named after him. Francis G. Benedict, his contributions to our understanding of metabolic rate is so substantial that even 100 years later, we're still often using the Benedict equation to determine metabolic rate. What he did 100 years ago. These massive brains came together to collaborate on one project, which was to try to understand the metabolism of people in, quote, severe diabetes. There was no such thing as type 1 or type 2 yet. Insulin hadn't even been discovered yet. What they found in these people with severe diabetes is that their metabolic rate was way too high. It was 20% higher than it should have been. Something wasn't right in their bodies that was making them waste energy way too much. And that was as far as they could get because insulin had not been found yet. 10 years later, it was found. And then decades later, in 1984, a group out of the University of Minnesota, they kind of followed up on this work. I look at it as a follow-up, although they didn't cite the original work by Joslin and Benedict, like I think they should have. They found, not only did they confirm with these much fancier techniques that the metabolic rate was about, again, 20% too high in these untreated type 1 diabetics, but now they had the benefit of being able to treat with insulin. And they found, as I reproduce it here to keep my particular aesthetic, for a guy who looks like I do, I have a shocking interest in aesthetics. But maybe I'm trying to make up for something. But here, they found that with the untreated type 1 diabetics, the moment they gave them insulin, from that very minute, metabolic rate started to drop. This is the literal figure. I just superimposed my own lines on it to make it look a little prettier. So exact, boom, inject insulin, metabolic rate drops. The same thing happens in people with type 2 diabetes. When you take the hyperinsulinemic, insulin-resistant type 2 diabetic and put them on insulin therapy, one of the reasons they gain so much fat so quickly is that their metabolic rate slows, just like you have it happening in a type 1 diabetic. This phenomenon of insulin-promoting fat storage is so apparent to the type 1 diabetic that they are sometimes tempted to engage in a form of an eating disorder that is called diabulimia. You can hear the eating disorder within it, although they do not have to. Imagine the temptation for a young teenager who feels pressure to be thin and look pretty or handsome. They're skinny as can be and they're eating as much as they want in their untreated diabetic state. They feel miserable, of course. They feel like dying. They are, slowly. Then they begin their insulin therapy. They start to feel better. They eat less and they start gaining fat. So much fat that by the time they leave the hospital, they often cannot wear the same clothes they came in with. And they have learned that their insulin are their so-called fat shots. And they have learned that they can eat as much as they want. They don't have to starve themselves and they don't have to vomit. They can eat as much as they want and enjoy all that satisfaction. And as long as they don't poke themselves with the needle, they can stay as thin as they want. So unlimited consumption, just skip the insulin injections and they're as skinny as they want. Of course, it works very, very well, but their ketones are acidic levels, their glucose levels are in the 8 or 900 milligrams per deciliter. They are dying, but they look great. And so you can imagine the temptation that they have. So if insulin is low, fat cells must shrink. Now let's flip it around just for the sake of time. I got to speed up a little bit. What if energy is the first thing that is reduced? What if the person is overweight and insulin resistant and they say, I'm just going to go low calorie, and they don't even know to think about addressing their insulin? You can start to see how relevant this is. This is how most people do it. They just start cutting calories and they don't care about addressing their insulin. It's not even on their radar. What happens? If the high insulin has not been addressed, but energy consumption is going down, that insulin that's still high is going to be pushing the energy to storage. It's going to be telling fat cells or liver cells or muscle cells, hey, store more triglycerides, store more glycogen. And so the total amount of energy that's available in the blood starts to drop. Basically every nutrient that is caloric and can provide energy will start to go down in the blood. I said basically literally every nutrient will go down in the blood. Now that becomes a problem with the tissue that both has a high metabolic rate but has no capacity to store its own energy. That is the brain. The brain doesn't have a deep supply of triglycerides or lipids stored to burn for energy. The brain doesn't have a deep supply of glycogen to use. The brain, with its very high metabolic rate, must constantly be getting its energy from the blood. And so it panics. it senses the reduced total energy availability. And now it either will die, it either is death or go to unconscious, which can happen, or it's reduced function until we slow metabolic rate, slow function in order to try to survive and reduce our energy needs. But it's going to promote a massive degree of hunger. It's going to sense this reduction in energy, and it's going to say, hey, this much energy doesn't match with how much I need to continue to function. Eat. Stomach, start rumbling. It's time to put something in there, because we can't survive long on this. But this becomes a problem, as we'll get to. Now, each of these respective paradigms is manifested in its own type of diet. The low energy or low calorie diet is a low fat diet, of course, whereas the insulin lowering diet, that's typically reflected, of course, in the low carb diet. Now, just to justify for a moment our use of carbohydrate restriction, this is, once again, a reproduction. It's actual data with my own line superimposed on it. This is what happens when a non-diabetic human, without type 1 diabetes, eats these macronutrients. You can notice that fat has no effect, and it does not. I have literally never seen a single study in a non-diabetic population, including my own research that we'll publish soon enough, that shows any insulin response to fat. If you've heard otherwise, you've been misled. Dietary fat will not increase insulin. Same with protein. It is not statistically significant. However, you eat carbohydrate, then yes, of course, you get a significant effect. Insulin will go up by 10 to 20 times, and in an insulin-sensitive person, it'll be back down to normal by about 3 hours. Now remember, most people are not insulin sensitive. If you did the same thing in an insulin-resistant person, that glucose level can stay high with up to 5 or 6 hours. Now, even one step further, if you take an insulin-sensitive group and give them about 400 grams of carbs, which, let's admit, is not hard to do. This was done in college-aged males, a study that I'm referring to here. They took young college-aged males. That's just a couple bowls of cereal, for goodness. I could do that. And I'd be delighted to do that. Their insulin levels in these insulin-sensitive college-aged males was elevated for over 10 hours. Now imagine when we start compounding. If you start taking the typical individual who's not only eating 70% of all their calories from carbs, but they're eating 6 times a day, you begin to see how chronically elevated insulin is such a problem. Where most people are spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin, and frankly, depending on what their evening snack is, well into their non-waking moments as well. So the majority of the person's life is spent with elevated insulin, promoting insulin resistance and promoting fat mass or fat cell expansion. Okay, now let's come back to this idea, where if energy is down, but insulin was elevated, remember, that is promoting energy into the fat cells, depriving the brain of energy. Can you see the problem then with this? If we continue to keep an elevated insulin while we are reducing calories, we will die. The way the body adjusts this then is that if calories are coming down, insulin will too. This is an enormous confounding variable that pervades every single low carb versus low fat study you've ever seen and you've ever heard of, including in talks this morning. Every one of these, every time you take patients or subjects that are eating a standard American diet and put them on the low fat, low calorie diet, they're eating fewer calories, but they're also in every instance eating fewer carbs. That's a confounding variable, right? Can you see the problem? You're eating less of everything, carbs included. Well, the confounding variable then is that they're also going to experience a reduction in insulin. To just prove this point, every study I have seen that's measured low-fat versus low-carb diets and measured insulin has seen a reduction in insulin, including this 2-year study, not the same one Lucia shared with us, a different one, but similar enough. This was 3 different diets. There was the low-fat diet, which was also low-calorie, so it was a hypocaloric. Then compared to a slightly higher fat, but also low-calorie, Mediterranean so-called, that can mean whatever the scientists want it to mean. And then there's the low-carb diet, which was calorie unrestricted. It just had a limit of carbs. Now you'll notice I have a bit of change there, and I'll show you that in just a moment, where it started at 20 grams and then changed. So in each one of these instances, the low-fat diet showed the worst results, and the low-carb diet showed the best, even though it was calorie unrestricted. Now, however, the point I'm trying to make is that every low-calorie diet is also an insulin-lowering diet, and that was what was found here too. But before I go there, I wanted to show you the weight change. This was the weight change over 24 months on the low-fat diet, the weight change on the Mediterranean diet, and then the low-carb diet was very odd because, boy, did it have a precipitous drop, and then it was immediately rebounded. What happened here? This was when the scientists were troubled by the degree of weight loss, and so they told them to go from 20 grams up to 120 grams a day. It was actually a real-time change in the study that was admitted. They were worried about the degree of weight loss and that it might skew the results. Isn't that unfortunate? But even still, that group had the greatest drop in insulin. Then the Mediterranean diet, but even the low-fat diet had a reduction in fasting insulin. And every single low-calorie or low-fat diet that takes a typical high-carb, high-fat standard American diet and then goes to a low-fat and lower-carb than they were eating before diet has a reduction in insulin. That is a confounding variable that has to be resolved. One last thing, I added this in last week actually. This was a meta-analysis of looking at metabolic changes across 3 common diets. They found, so normally, by way of background, metabolic rate is coupled to body weight. That's largely what the Benedict equation was showing, that metabolic rate equation that is still used today. That the bigger a body is, the higher the metabolic rate. The smaller the body, the lower the metabolic rate. So no surprise that if someone is losing weight, what happens to metabolic rate? It goes down. That's normal and never need be a cause of concern. It's just what happens. However, what this study found is that the orange bar, the low-carb group, they had an insignificant reduction in their calories, even though they lost the exact same amount of weight. That's what that little orange bar is showing. This is looking at calories per day, a reduction in energy. They had them all lose the exact same amount of weight, so same amount of weight loss, and then looked at the changes in metabolic rate. Again, this paper just came out last week. This low-carb group, that was not statistically significant. So essentially, their metabolic rate stayed the exact same as it was before they lost the weight. And then as you started restricting, in fact, this conclusion stated it well. For every 1% increase in carbohydrate intake causing the weight loss, there was a reduction in 2.3 calories per day. In contrast, a 1% increase in protein and fat increased resting energy expenditure by 3, even with the weight loss. So here's one group where their metabolic rate was down almost 300 calories per day compared to the group that lost the same amount of fat with the low-carb diet. Don't tell me one of these isn't going to outperform the other in the long term. One will certainly prove the winner. So how can we address this confounding variable? Again, the confounding variable being that every low-fat diet from a standard American diet will lower the insulin. Thus, every one of these studies has made it inherently impossible to truly compare the insulin model of obesity compared to the thermodynamic or caloric model. So in order to actually resolve this, how can we account? We have to flip the whole thing around. And rather than doing low-calorie weight loss studies, we need to test this by doing hypercaloric weight gain studies. This has literally never been done. It has not been done in any clinical trial. We have never tried to see which diet makes it harder to gain fat. Is that making sense? Yeah. That there's this massive confounding variable is baked into the cake when it comes to low carb, low calorie, low fat dieting. So in order to really test this, we have to see which diet makes it harder to get fat on. That's the hypercaloric idea. So that would test the caloric theory versus the endocrine theory of why fat cells get big and why they would get small. I say no large-scale study's ever been done. There has literally only been one study, and it was an N of 1. A case study published by Dr. Eric Westman at Duke and Sam Feltham in the UK. It was his own study, Sam's own study, and he had a very good washout period. It was very well controlled. He had 2 diets, basically saying, if I eat 5,800 calories a day for these several weeks, and then wash out back to my normal weight, then flip it to the other one, which one will I get fatter on? So it was 5,800 calories of a low-fat diet, 5,800 calories of a low-carb diet. That's a pretty high calorie. Most people are going to gain weight on that. Sam included. This was the macronutrient breakdown, and you can see the difference in carbs versus fat with a little difference in protein too. But the carbs, 64% on the low-fat diet, 6% on the low-carb. Fat, 22% on the low-fat diet, 72% on the low-carb diet. And then he looked at two primary outcomes, body weight and waist circumference, which is really, really good. It's helpful to have both of these variables because, of course, body weight can be made up of much more than just fat. All right, what happened then? On the low-fat diet, 5,800 calories a day, he gained 7.1 kilograms. Now, I'm Canadian enough to appreciate that, and you are familiar enough. That's a lot of, that's all getting up almost to 20 pounds of fat gain over these few weeks. In contrast, on the low-carb diet, he only gained 1.3 kilograms. Despite eating the same number of calories and getting back and washing out for the exact same mass where he started from. His waist circumference went up by 9.2 centimeters on the low-fat diet, hypercaloric. On the hypercaloric low-carb diet, his waist circumference shrunk. It went down by 3 centimeters. So, my final idea to teach you is to leave you with the question, how big are your fat cells? If I have given you an appreciation that the size of fat cells matters more than the mass of fat, you want to know what your fat cell size is. But also, just as an aside, this explains why some people can be fatter and yet have better metabolic markers. I'm not saying they're healthy, but their metabolic markers can be better than someone who's relatively leaner. We saw this in Singapore. You take a chubby Caucasian compared to a chubby South Asian or Asian Chinese guy, those two guys have fatty liver disease, they have hypertension and prediabetes or frank type 2 diabetes. Whereas the Caucasian is just a little chubby. And every other marker's fine. This is also why some people can get to 600 pounds and be the star of a reality TV show. Most people in this room could never get that fat. You could eat yourself to death and you couldn't get that fat because your fat cells would have reached their limit and become insulin resistant to prevent further growth. We've talked about that now already. Now, nevertheless, back to my concluding point. How can you determine? You can do something called the adipo-IR index. If you can get your physician to measure both of these uncommon metabolic outcomes, namely fasting insulin and fasting free fatty acids, you multiply them. In men, that number should be less than 5. If that number is less than 5, it suggests that you have relatively small fat cells and you are insulin sensitive, or your fat cells are insulin sensitive. Remember, you are now detecting insulin resistance at the very point of origin. Before it might have even, the HOMA-IR score, a whole body marker of insulin resistance, could still be normal. You're getting it at the very earliest signal. In women, it should be less than 8. Now, why the difference? So many of these metabolic markers are the same across the sexes. The difference is because women burn much more fat than men at any moment. So a woman's free fatty acids, yes, I said that correctly. I never misstate things because I'm so torturously going over it all in my mind before I actually say it. Women have much higher levels of free fatty acids because the fat cells in the female are turning over so much more rapidly. Not the cells. I just did miss. I cursed myself. It's the lipids within the fat cell. While they are pulling in more fat than the male fat cell counterparts, they're also breaking it down more rapidly, and that's entirely a function of the estrogens. But nevertheless, at any given moment, a female's free fatty acids will be higher than her male counterpart is. She's burning more fat and breaking down more fat than the man is, and that's what skews this result up a little bit. So females, you want that score to be less than 8. Males, you want it to be less than 5 because I am privileged to be a professor at a private religious university, which means I can state definitively men and women are not the same. Thankfully. Yes. Thank you. But we see that reflected even here at the first point of the insulin resistance beginning, namely the fat cell. Thanks for listening. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.